Today, the subcommittee will hear testimony regarding U.S. sanctions policy in Africa. Sanctions can either lead to successful outcomes or exacerbate the very issues they seek to remedy and reflect poorly on those seeking to advance them. As with most things, the devil is in the details. In my experience, unilateral economic sanctions by themselves rarely, if ever, achieve their intended goal, and I have been long suspect of unilateral economic sanctions. I've witnessed firsthand how non-targeted economic sanctions can apply pressure to those who have no direct link to the levers of power in a country. Now, looking beyond the issue of multi versus unilateral economic sanctions, there are other factors in play in determining whether or not targeted individual sanctions on a country are warranted and are likely to be an effective tool. Right now, the United States has targeted individual sanctions in place for 9 sub-Saharan countries: Burundi, Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Eritrea, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, and Zimbabwe. I should say that these are targeted individual sanctions on individuals in those countries. We also have arms export restrictions in place against most of these countries, and enforcement of both these and financial sanctions can obviously be a challenge for these African countries. Today, we aim to step back and explore the effectiveness of some of these efforts. We'll examine the recent track record of sanctions in Africa, when they've proven to be a useful tool in achieving our policy objectives, and under what circumstances they are falling flat or causing unintended consequences. We'll look at the relationship between sanctions undertaken solely by the United States versus those in concert with the international community. Finally, I hope we'll get a better understanding from today's discussion of whether we are overusing or underusing sanctions or the threat of sanctions in Africa. We often hear elected officials advocate for the use of sanctions as a foreign policy tool. I'm rarely among those pushing for sanctions, but as those calls arise, we will all benefit from hearing from our witnesses to hear what they have to say about sanctions in Africa. This hearing is especially timely, considering the calls for sanctions on the DRC that have been forthcoming from Congress and elsewhere in previous weeks. I look forward to hearing the witnesses today. I've met with a number of you already, and look forward to hearing your verbal testimony. And with that, turn it over to Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. And thank you for having such an important hearing. Last year, you and I and Senator Coon had the tremendous pleasure of accompanying President Obama on his historic trip to Kenya and Ethiopia. On that trip, we attended a large public event at the African Union in Addis Ababa. Throughout the front of that massive auditorium sat many of Africa's heads of state, and the President delivered a speech about the responsibility those leaders have to build and respect democracy in Africa. He reinforced a message he had delivered on his first trip to the continent as president years earlier, that, and I quote, "Africa doesn't need strong men, it needs strong institutions." As the president spoke, he looked at those leaders and told them that as much as he would like to continue in office as President of the United States, the Constitution of the United States, like many constitutions in Africa and around the world, limits him to 2 terms. He told them that not even he, as president, is above the law. He explained that even the president must respect the rules of the game because governance is fundamentally about trust. Promises made and promises kept between elected leaders and the people who elected them. Changing or ignoring those rules risks breaking that trust and sending a society towards turmoil and instability. Many of the leaders in the front rows sat stone-faced and silent, not accustomed to such straight talk. If they had been the only ones in the room, the silence would have been stunning. But they weren't the only ones in the room. You, Mr. Chairman, Senator Coons, and I, we saw it packed in all the way to the ceiling were ordinary people from around the African continent. After they heard President Obama's words, they cheered so loudly that it shook the building. The people of Africa are the heirs of hundreds of years of exploitation and violence, first by colonial powers and all too often by their own leaders since Africa was decolonized. They are people who have been fighting hard against repression and corruption and are now working to build democracies throughout the continent. They are counting the promises made about freedom and prosperity. 2 weeks ago, I introduced a resolution calling for targeted sanctions in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where President Joseph Kabila has been using every tactic at his disposal to manipulate institutions, suppress political opposition, and delay elections to try to remain in power beyond the end of his mandate, a mandate set by DRC's people in their own constitution. For many months, President Obama, Secretary Kerry, Assistant Secretary Thomas Greenfield, Special Envoy Tom Perriello, and Ambassador James Swan have engaged in a determined diplomatic effort to persuade President Kabila to commit to stepping aside at the end of this term, as specifically required in the Congo Constitution. But now, with just 5 months left until elections are supposed to happen, it has become clear that our diplomats need additional tools to communicate how seriously the United States views the actions of President Kabila and his government, and to demonstrate our commitment to the Congolese people. Some may ask, why is this important? Well, you only have to look next door into the wider region to see why it is so important. Next door in Burundi, President Nkurunziza's unconstitutional election to a third term last year sparked violence that has cost the lives of hundreds, displaced thousands, and threatens to reignite ethnic tensions. And it doesn't stop there. This weekend, I read a report about Kenya's new mood, describing massive protests that have already erupted in anticipation of elections there next year, amid concerns that President Kenyatta has manipulated the Electoral Commission in his favor. Kenyan security forces have once again cracked down on protesters and attempted to ban protests, and in direct violation of multiple court rulings and its country's constitution, multiple protesters have already been killed, stoking a very legitimate fear that 2017 could see a repeat of the horrific violence surrounding the elections of 2007. So sanctions in DRC are not only about DRC. President Kenyatta will be watching our approach to DRC to see just how much he can get away with. For the sake of the people of Burundi, DRC, Kenya, and others in the region, I think we have to make absolutely clear that the United States stands with the people and democracy and will not tolerate leaders who use force or manipulation to hold on to power or break their most fundamental promises to their own people. Those sanctions, I believe, should be targeted at those officials in the government of DRC who are responsible for violence and human rights violations and undermining the democratic processes or institutions. I believe such targeted sanctions specifically designed to avoid negatively impacting ordinary Congolese, would make a significant impact on Kabila's calculations going forward as he comes to realize that his actions will have consequences. Beyond influencing Kabila's decisions, though, sanctions are about making a statement about America's commitment to the Congolese people. Sanctions are about making clear to the Congolese people that we will not help entrench strong men, but will always lend a helping hand to people working to build strong institutions and prosperous societies. Sanctions in cases like these are an important way in which the U.S. communicates to the people in the balcony, Congolese, Burundians, Sudanese, Kenyans, and others, that promises made must be kept, that we will not help strong men break promises to their people.